Hello and welcome to what is the last module for Justice, Ends and Means, which has, for me at least, come around pretty quickly. The next 2 weeks of class we'll be running simulated job interviews. It's not a requirement, but if you are interested, it's a great experience. And it's very useful, even this early in your studies, to understand how the process works, to get experience both sitting in on both sides of the table as an applicant, as a member of the panel, to understand how the process works. So if you want to be involved in that, please send me an email and I can start putting some teams together. And otherwise, let's get on to the last module. So summing up, where we've been this term, we've done a really quick run through a lot of the major spheres of thought, bodies of thought, theories around what justice is. Learning more about it, of course, is a lifetime project, but I wanted to end with some new interesting developments and some new ideas that have come along in the field of justice to help us understand. And one of them is linked to CQ University's role as a changemaker university. And that's based on the concept of social innovation. And that is a concept that looks at our involvement in the community in developing, in instigating social change, but not in a way that is charitable or done in a way that's merely done as an act of charity. Social innovation is about engaging with the community, engaging with their wants and needs, and being part of that community and helping the community move towards change. So it's a very contemporary view, and it's quite different from the old idea of professional duty, where professions had this sort of obligation to, the needy and the people unjustly treated in society. And it was very much a power relationship framework for thinking about change. Change making is much more about a sense of equality, of co-design of change, and of community empowerment, rather than this idea of welfare or charity or giving by itself. So CQ University is the first Australian university to join up with the Ahsoka Changemaking Network that originated out of Harvard University. It's an international network of universities that aspire towards producing graduates who are skilled at those change-making skills. And I know that was just a tautology, but in your notes you'll see there's a reference to the iChange module, which is a bit of only takes you an hour or so to work through, but it's a set of online resources that teaches you all about social innovation. And when you complete it, you get a certificate. And when we've been talking last week about portfolios, this iChange certificate is a great artifact to put in your portfolio. It's a great thing to put in there to show employers that you have training in this 21st century way of thinking. So connected to those ideas, and all these ideas intermesh with each other, and incidentally they also intermesh with Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous ways of thinking as well. So there's a whole lot of overlap between them, but we're also going to look at the idea of systems thinking, and we're going to look at design thinking, which is sometimes called human-centered design. So those are explored in the materials, pardon me, which are a bit longer than usual this week, but I thought it was useful to actually have some diagrams and some explanation of how things work. Now, you're not going to become an accomplished systems thinker or design thinker with 1 week's worth of study, but I wanted to introduce these ideas now. There have been ideas that have been included throughout the criminology degree, and they're skills that you will build and develop over time. And these are things that there's a real need for graduates with these capabilities who are able to problem solving using these new and interesting tool sets. So let's start briefly about systems thinking. There's a few useful videos on the connected in the notes, and one that I didn't even think was terribly it was interesting but wasn't terribly vital when I first wrote this material years ago, before 2019, was some material from the Centre for Disease Control about the importance of systems mapping on pandemic spread. So in some ways we were all forced, well, I suppose we weren't all forced, but a lot of us were forced to become systems thinkers in many ways with the introduction of a pandemic, where we were forced to think about the ways in which complex systems interact with each other in a way that we hadn't before. You know, before you get something like a pandemic, it's very easy to think about a nation having a border, states having borders and being separate. But when you have something that doesn't respect borders, that can move in complex ways, like a pandemic disease, you suddenly realize that our models as they stood are very simple, and often too simple to take account of the problems that we face. And all the problems we're facing in this century coming up are very complex. They're interdisciplinary. They're what we call wicked problems. They involve multiple disciplines to solve, and everyone collaborating on those problems. So systems thinking is a great foundation for that. There's a book I recommend in the notes, which is Danella Meadows' Thinking in Systems, a primer. It's not very expensive. It's very readable. The diagrams I've used here are from that. And I think it's, for me and for others that I've discussed this with, it's a bit of a life changer, because when you read it, it opens your mind to thinking about problems in a more complex way, whether that problem be environmental collapse, or the problem of just trying to organize a bunch of 4-year-olds for an outing. Systems thinking works at scale. And for people who are working as criminologists, working in the criminal justice system, one of the good things about systems thinking is that the phrase criminal justice system has the word system in it. Like, systems thinking is implicit when we talk about a criminal justice system. But it gives you tools for understanding how systems work, how they're divided into subsystems, and how the subsystems work with each other or fail to interact with each other. So a large part of what systems thinkers do is try to map out in diagrams the way systems operate and the flows between systems and the mechanisms that operate those flows. So, a good old-fashioned flow chart, something starts at this end, works its way through different systems. There's branches where there are options that can go in different ways, but you can actually understand how that system works. Now, this has been used really effectively in the Victorian courts recently, where they have a lot of problem with very old buildings that weren't really designed for the volume of people. And a design firm called Portable came in and did a redesign using systems thinking on the way traffic flows through the courts, the way people move around, where they seek information, where they need to go from point A to point B, and so on. And using that kind of diagrammatic approach enabled them to develop new ways of guiding people through the court system without having to build an entirely new building, but using what they got to refine those ways people move around and to provide the right cues to have people go to the right place, and not this constant congestion of crowds that the courts were facing. So systems are usually bureaucratic or mechanical, but sometimes they can actually be sort of physical flows like that. If you've spent time in a hospital recently for any reason, you'll know that hospitals are generally pretty bad in terms of this kind of systems and flows in the system. Going into the hospital and just trying to find where to go, hitting the information desk, getting some information, being sent into the labyrinth of a hospital, only to find that the information you got wasn't right, or you misheard it, and then some angry person tells you have to go somewhere else and ask someone else, and that person isn't there at the moment. Hospitals are another system like the courts, where people are really stressed going into them, and the actual systems that are supposed to help people don't often help. So I don't know of any work in Australia, but there's been a lot of good work in the UK around designing hospitals that are human-facing and human-friendly. And the same goes for administrative systems too. You know, the process, you reflect on the process of you know, going from being an outsider to being a student here at CQU, and think about how easy to navigate, easy to understand the process. You know, often it's around the website as well, but the process, the procedures, the documents, and everything else. How human friendly was that? Could that have been designed in a way that would be less stressful? So on page 7 of the notes, there's a really simple example of a system diagram about trees. You'll see that there's the flows that move from left to right. There are little clouds at the beginning and end of the diagrams, and that's what systems thinkers use to put sort of the complex exit or endpoints to a system. So you're basically saying it's a whole lot of complex stuff that goes on outside this system, and we're using that cloud to indicate that that's, you know, something will come into a system there, but we don't understand all of that system. So the first thing in the diagram is tree growth, and there's a whole lot of things around the environment and land and whatever else that leads to greater or lesser degrees of growth of trees. And what we're saying with that cloud is we're not focusing on that stuff now. It's too complex for our diagram to encompass, but we're starting with this idea that trees grow. And then each phase, there's a little tap on the diagram that's saying there's an intervention point where you can change things. So we can change the amount of tree growth in various ways. I mean, we can chop down more or less trees. We can plant more or less trees, more or fewer trees, and so on. The boxes indicate, you know, the parts of the system where we have what we call stocks, and stocks are a resource in the system. So the tree growth produces wood in living trees. The wood in living trees goes in two directions from that diagram. It either gets logged and becomes lumber, another stock, another resource, or the trees die, and then that goes into that imponderable cloud again. So have a look at that diagram, have a look at the discussion of that diagram, but think about the potential of using this form of thinking about any systems that have decision points, and crucially they have control points where you can exercise control over something. You know, navigating a website has a number of points at which you can try and control the experience for the website user and give them an idea of, you know, well, guidance as to do this or do that. The other element, before we finish our quick overview of systems thinking, is on page 8, where we talk about feedback loops. And feedback loops make a system more complex, but that's where something that happens at another part of the system will feed back and change an earlier part of the system. Now, again, we're just touching on the surface here. I don't think you need to thoroughly understand these diagrams, thoroughly understand systems thinking at this point in your studies, but I wanted to show them to you to give you an idea of this different way of visualizing and thinking around systems, and thinking about things like particularly the criminal justice system, thinking about the correction systems, about taking that top-down view and looking at the systems themselves rather than looking at, say, the text of the legislation or the individual text. It gives you another tool in your inventory. Speaking of which, the next one I want to cover briefly is design thinking. Design thinking was a really big deal a few years ago. It goes in and out of fashion a little bit, but a design thinking approach is the best I can put. But the best way I can put it is it is a principled approach to change. So, and what I mean by principled is that you use a set of principles and you use a particular process to affect change and to help you and support you making change. The opposite of a design approach would be an ad hoc approach, And this is unfortunately what we do very often in society, where we go, oh, we need to change things. Let's just do this, and let's do something different. And then we'll just create something different, and now we'll do something different. And often that's very unsatisfactory, particularly when we come to social change. It's often where we get knee-jerk reactions, where we see a social problem and we go, what do we do about it? Oh, let's just do this. Why are we doing it? Well, because. Great example of that is, youth crime. There's perceptions that there arises in youth crime. What do we do about it? We get tough on youth crime. We get tough on young people. We get tough on offenders. Why are we doing this? We don't know, but we feel better about doing it. Do we know that there's an increase in youth crime? No, we haven't checked. And if we do check, we find that there isn't really one. But the idea of design thinking is to take a step back and to use a process. And what most design thinkers use is a 5-stage process, 6-stage process, which is a cycle. It's an iterative process where you go about redesigning an approach to a problem. And the core of it is the idea of prototyping, and this comes from industrial design and other fields of design. But it's the idea that before you make a change, you create a prototype, you test it, and you see if it works. You learn from what you've done with the prototype, and then you place what you've learned back into the system of change, and you develop a new prototype until you've got one that you're happy with. Now that sounds like common sense, and it sounds like something that we should be doing, but you probably be amazed at how rarely this happens in the real world. It happens in industrial design. You have people in IKEA testing hinges on cupboard doors, creating new kinds of hinges, testing them hundreds of times to see what happens. And industrial design is very familiar with this idea. You produce a new pair of shoes, and you test them to make sure the heels last more than a week, hopefully, unless you get them from Shein. And that they're safe for people to wear, and they don't cause injuries and all those sorts of things. So in the world of products, we are much more aware of the type of things that you need to do to produce prototypes and test prototypes. But in the world of social policy, and the world of criminal justice policy, we're pretty bad at it. And when we do produce prototypes, we often don't have any follow-through. So the world is full of brilliant young offender programs that have been run once on funding, and then the funding has expired and they never run again. And that's heartbreaking. I mean, you look at, if you get a chance later in your studies to look at criminology and young offenders, the criminology journals are full of articles where it was like, well, we had this great idea. We'd work with young at-risk people and young offenders. We'd do this in the community. We got funded for it. We did it. It was really successful. So there was great outcomes and results. But then we couldn't get funding to continue it for another year, and it's just stopped. And the young offenders are now gone back to offending again. And it's a significant problem with the way we fund research, in the way we fund social change, the way we manage social change. So a better approach, if it can be managed, is this cycle of prototyping and testing that is sustainable, where you produce things that have an ongoing life. So just to very quickly run through the cycles of design thinking. There's a lot of different models, but this is the one that's used most often. It starts with an empathize stage, where you actually get to understand the people for whom the product, service, whatever is being created. Again, you'd be surprised how often people launch in to create things, create policies and programs, and they don't ask the people who it's going to affect. And then they get kind of resentful when the people who it's created for just say, oh, it's not really what we wanted. It's like, well, we did all this work. We created this thing for you. And it's like, yeah, but did you ask if someone wanted it? So design thinking always starts with that idea of need, and it's a human-based process of empathy, where you spend time with people in the community and you understand what their needs actually are. Second is a discovery process, which is where you gather all your information. This is also like a research process. You get all your information together. 3 is the create process. Sometimes called the ideation process, which doesn't sound fabulous, so we'll go about create, which is where you create lots of different ideas. You brainstorm ideas, options, and so on. And then out of that comes the prototype phase, where you pick one and you prototype it. You create a mock-up of the model, and you use a hypothetical environment to test the thing. So, IKEA has machinery that'll open and close their hinges tens of thousands of times over 6 months to see if their hinges break. Someone who's designing a new pair of shoes will have someone wearing the shoes around on a regular basis to see if they break, or if they, cause more injury to the wearer than is, necessary, depending on the shoes. But you actually run through that process of testing, and then you evaluate. You have evaluation criteria, and you say, was this successful? Where wasn't this successful? What could be improved? And the final stage, which is known as the iterative stage, is where you complete the circle and you go back into the process. So you make a decision based on the evaluation. You go, is this thing we got good enough? Or do we have to go back, all the way back to the empathize phase, take this product back to the people that it serves and ask them, does this serve your interest? And then we go through the whole cycle again. So design thinking, it's particularly becoming particularly important in the world of law and justice, and particularly in an area where we've spent decades, trying different things without any particular follow through, without these kind of evaluation and sustainable processes. So again, that's a very quick run through design thinking, but it's something for you to keep in mind. It's something we're going to come back to in the criminology unit criminology courses from time to time, and it's a different approach to the traditional old-fashioned approaches, particularly around legal change, where everyone says there's a problem with something and then the government just decides to do something, often without much consultation, and then everyone says that's worse than it was before, because there's been no principles or no process to that change process. We had an example of this a few years ago. It was pre-COVID, so it was quite a few years ago, in Melbourne, where they introduced lockdowns, where bars closed their doors and people were allowed out but weren't allowed back in after midnight. It was 2 a.m. I think, and this was because of the problems of violence in nightclubs. And someone had the bright idea of, well, what we'll do is we'll just, lock the doors and we won't let the drunk people to come into clubs once they've left. Problem was, the public transport in Melbourne at that point stopped at midnight and didn't start again till 6 a.m. So when people left clubs, what they actually ended up with was groups of very angry drunk people wandering around the city with nowhere to go. And without the ability to go back into other clubs, and just getting more and more aggravated. So you've basically moved any potential possibility of violence, to a certainty of violence with these gangs of drunk, angry people roaming the streets. So that's an example of the way we tend to do things in terms of legal change, in terms of justice system change. We do this sort of ad hoc stuff and then regret it later, whereas a design thinking approach gives you a foundation for doing this in a sensible way. All right, so today we've looked at social innovation, we've looked at systems thinking, we've looked at design thinking. Again, we've only really been able to touch on those as ideas. We haven't been able to train you, but we'll be getting more of that as you go. There'll be more of that content throughout your criminology studies. So I guess at this point, this is my last mini lecture that I'll be recording and distributing. And of course, we've got the end of term assessment and everything to conclude, so good luck with that. But I'd also like to say, please stay in touch. Just because I'm not teaching you in a unit doesn't mean you can't get in contact with me. If you want some advice, if you want some to ask me about something, or you just want to chat about things generally, please don't be shy about making contact again, because the contacts you make and the people that you introduce yourself to as part of your studies will last you throughout your life. There are people, you may never contact me again. You might not be interested, but also you might end up with a situation in your work 10 years from now, presuming I'm still working 10 years from now, and you're able to get in contact with me and I can help you out with something. That's a possibility. Or you might better help me out with something. But the thing about being in a learning community is that it's more than just a commercial transaction. It's being about a part of something that's bigger. So please get in contact, have a chat, and I'll hopefully see you again.